This happened in early 2002, not long after I turned 21. At the time, I was living with my dad in Columbus, Ohio, which already felt strange because I'd grown up in a completely different world. I was raised in a wealthy area outside Seattle, went to private school, then college, and then dropped out without much of a plan. I was dealing with depression, drinking too much, drifting between jobs and people, and making a lot of choices without thinking too far ahead. My mom eventually decided that some distance might help, so she sent me to live with my dad across the country. Living with him didn't really help either. He struggled with alcoholism and worked long hours, and I mostly existed in the house like an overgrown teenager. I worked a retail job, slept odd hours, and didn't feel like I was moving toward anything. One morning I found him passed out in the living room, and something about that moment made me realize I needed to leave before I got even more stuck. I wanted to go back to Seattle, but my mom wouldn't let me move in again. Out of options, I called my best friend from back home. Her family didn't have much money, but they scraped together enough to buy me a Greyhound ticket and a train pass, and told me I could stay with them until I figured things out. My dad agreed to drive me to the bus station before his shift started. The problem was my bus wasn't leaving until later that afternoon, so I'd be stuck at the station for hours. He was visibly nervous about leaving me there, and warned me repeatedly that the area wasn't safe. I brushed it off. I'd taken public transportation alone plenty of times, even late at night in Seattle, and I thought I knew how to handle myself. We arrived at the Greyhound station downtown mid-morning. It was cold, gray, and already felt unwelcoming. Dad helped me unload my 2 suitcases, which held basically everything I owned. There were lockers inside, but I couldn't afford to use them, so I was stuck keeping the bags with me. He hugged me goodbye, lingered like he wanted to say more, then finally left for work. I watched his car pull away and suddenly felt very alone. Inside the terminal was quiet and dull, with people scattered around waiting. After sitting for a while, I decided to step outside to smoke. I positioned my suitcases near the front desk so I could still see them from the entrance, and went just outside the doors. I was digging through my purse for a cigarette when a man wearing a bulky knit hat approached and asked if he could bum one. I gave him one and a light. He didn't seem threatening, maybe a bit rough around the edges, but nothing unusual. We made small talk about the cold and travel. He asked where I was headed, and I mentioned I was waiting for a bus. While we talked, I noticed an older man standing on the other side of the entrance watching us. I didn't think much of it at the time. The man in the knit hat mentioned that there was a gas station around the corner if I wanted to buy more cigarettes. I considered it, but my luggage was inside, and I didn't want to leave it unattended, so I declined and went back in. Over the next few hours, I went outside a few more times to smoke. Each time, the same man was there. He kept bringing up the gas station, even offering to walk with me. I still didn't feel scared, just mildly uncomfortable, and I continued to refuse because of my bags. The last time I went outside, the atmosphere had changed. The sidewalk was empty. The noise from earlier was gone. I set my purse down near my feet while I smoked. The man appeared again and asked me for money. This time something in me tightened. I said I didn't have anything to spare. I bent down to grab my purse, and suddenly he reached for it and said something like, "Let me help you with that." I pulled it toward myself and told him I was fine. His demeanor shifted instantly. His voice dropped, sharp and angry, and he demanded that I give him the purse. He pressed his body against mine, trying to shove me sideways. I froze for half a second, then started yelling for help as loudly as I could. He cursed at me, told me to shut up, and pushed again. I was terrified, convinced that if I let go, something much worse would happen. Out of nowhere, a voice shouted from nearby asking if everything was okay. The older man I'd noticed earlier stepped toward us. The attacker hesitated, released my purse, and ran off down the street. I didn't wait to see where he went. I rushed back inside the station, shaking so badly I could barely stand. For the rest of the day, I stayed close to the front desk, clutching my purse. I didn't trust anyone. When it was finally time to board, I scanned every passenger, convinced danger was everywhere. As I sat down on the bus, I heard someone behind me speak quietly. It was the older man. He told me he'd noticed the guy watching me earlier and wished he'd stepped in sooner. I thanked him, barely holding myself together. That encounter lasted less than a minute, but it changed how I moved through the world. The thought of how persistent the man had been about leading me away still unsettles me. The rest of the trip passed without incident, but I barely slept, barely ate, and never let my belongings out of my sight. By the time I reached Washington, watching snow-covered trees pass by the train window, I knew I wasn't the same person who'd walked into that bus station earlier that day. This happened when I was 18, not long after I moved to a much bigger city about half an hour away from the small town where I grew up. It was my first real apartment, and at the time I genuinely believed I'd landed in a decent, quiet area. I lived there for about 6 months with my boyfriend, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. Eventually, though, our relationship started falling apart. He lost his job, things got tense, and after a long, uncomfortable process of him dragging his feet, we agreed that I would take over the lease and he would move out. Once he was gone, a coworker of mine moved into the spare bedroom to help with rent, and for a while things felt stable again. One weekend in January, I'd gone out to see a musical in a nearby town. I didn't get home until a little after midnight. My roommate was out of town visiting family, so I had the apartment to myself. I kicked off my shoes, changed into something comfortable, and sat down in front of the TV with a bowl, finally relaxing. I wasn't being particularly quiet since I knew no one else was home. That's when I heard a knock on the front door. The clock on the TV said it was close to 1 a.m., and my first thought was disbelief. No one ever knocked on my door that late. The front door had a narrow window with blinds, and the glow from the TV made it obvious someone was home. I felt uneasy, but at 18, coming from a small town, I hadn't learned yet how seriously to take that feeling. I peeked through the blinds without opening the door and turned on the porch light. Standing there was a young man, probably mid-20s, slim build, dressed casually, and not immediately threatening. I remember actually sizing him up and thinking I could probably handle myself if I needed to. I called out through the door and asked what he wanted. He immediately launched into a fast, emotional explanation. He said he'd just been in a car accident right outside, that his young daughter was hurt, and that his phone had been thrown somewhere during the crash. He said he needed to call for help. Hearing that a child was injured hit me hard. I felt torn between fear and the urge to help. I told him I would call 911 for him, and he agreed, but then asked if he could also call the child's mother to explain what was happening. Even as I agreed, something didn't feel right. I cracked the door just enough to slide my phone out to him and immediately locked the door again once my hand was clear. While he stood outside supposedly making the call, I paced my living room, heart racing. I grabbed a kitchen knife and held it at my side, not because I had a plan, but because every instinct I had was telling me something was wrong. After a minute or two, I started to calm down slightly. I set the knife down on the couch and waited. When he knocked again to return my phone, I walked back to the door without thinking. I opened it just an inch. That's when everything shifted. From the shadow beside my doorway, a much larger figure stepped forward. I barely registered the ski mask before the door was forced inward, knocking me off my feet. Almost immediately, more figures followed. Suddenly, there were several people inside my apartment, moving quickly, shouting, blocking my way out. I was on the floor, stunned and trying to process what was happening, when one of them pulled out a gun and pointed it toward me. I remember how unreal it felt, like my brain couldn't fully accept what I was seeing. They were yelling at me to give them money, to hand everything over. Something in me snapped. I wasn't thinking clearly or logically. I just knew I couldn't stay on the floor and let them do whatever they wanted. I reacted on pure instinct. I pushed the gun away and tried to get to my feet, grabbing onto one of them to pull myself up. I fought back in every way I could, not because I thought I'd win, but because standing still felt impossible. I started screaming my neighbor's name over and over. Michael lived next door. He was former military, a big guy, and I knew he owned firearms. I screamed like he was already in the apartment, like help was right there. That seemed to change everything. They panicked and ran, grabbing my phone and purse on the way out. I chased after them briefly, barefoot in the snow, yelling for help until Michael actually appeared, holding a shotgun and asking what had happened. He tried to follow them but came back empty-handed. The police were called. I gave a statement. News crews showed up later, and the whole thing ended up being reported locally, though I refused to be interviewed. I didn't want attention. I just wanted it to be over. Looking back, I know how close things came to ending very differently. I moved out not long after, breaking my lease with the police report as proof. The landlord understood. I found another place and learned painfully to trust my instincts. I'm much more careful now. I don't open doors for strangers, no matter the story. I'd rather be cautious than ignore that quiet warning feeling again. That night changed the way I move through the world, and I don't think that will ever fully go away. My boyfriend and I live together, and he works as a teacher in a town about 15 minutes away by train. His schedule is pretty consistent, and he usually gets home around the same time every day, give or take an hour. I work from home, so I'm almost always in the apartment during the day. In late January, we got into one of those stupid arguments that spirals into a full-blown fight for no real reason. I honestly don't even remember what it was about now, but it was bad enough that we didn't talk, text, or acknowledge each other at all the following day. The apartment felt tense and quiet in that uncomfortable way that only happens after a fight like that. That afternoon, I was lying in bed working on my laptop. It was a Tuesday, and I knew his last class usually ended around 1 p.m., which meant he normally wouldn't be home until around 2:30. So when I heard the front door open and close at about 1, I barely reacted. I just assumed he'd skipped his last class and come home early, which he did occasionally. Mostly I was mentally preparing myself for the awkward post-fight interaction that was bound to happen. I stayed in bed, working, waiting for him to come into the bedroom and change his clothes like he always did. The door was closed, and I had my earplugs halfway in, which is how I usually work. Even with them in, I could hear heavy footsteps moving slowly around the apartment. At the time, I didn't question it. If I hadn't been so distracted by the lingering tension between us, I might have noticed how unusually slow the footsteps were, or how long someone seemed to be lingering in the living room. But I didn't. I just waited. After a while, the bedroom door slowly opened a few inches. I turned my head toward it, already bracing myself to make that stiff, polite eye contact that comes after a long silence. But the door didn't open any further. Instead, I saw a woman's hand on the doorknob. Her nails were painted bright red. The door then closed again, just as slowly as it had opened. I jumped out of bed and ripped the earplugs out, frozen in place as my brain tried to catch up with what I'd just seen. My first thought was immediate and very clear. That was not my boyfriend. Then I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was his mom, or his sister, or even the landlady. I don't know why, but my mind latched onto those explanations because they were less frightening. Convincing myself it must be someone familiar, I opened the bedroom door and stepped into the living room. No one was there. What was there, though, was the smell. The apartment reeked of strong, unfamiliar perfume. That was the moment reality really hit me. His mom and sister didn't have keys, and they'd never just dropped by unannounced. The landlady had never entered our apartment without telling us first. There was no reasonable explanation for what I'd just seen. I ran back into the bedroom and shut the door, my hands shaking. There's a small balcony attached to the bedroom, so even though it was cold and raining, I stepped outside and called my boyfriend. When he answered, I asked if there was any chance someone from his family had come by. He immediately said no and told me not to move. He said he was calling the police. They arrived quickly and searched the apartment. But by then, whoever had been there was long gone. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing valuable was missing. We even kept a jar of cash right by the entrance, and it hadn't been touched. It almost looked like whoever came in had walked straight to the bedroom, seen that someone was there, and left immediately. For a few days, we tried to convince ourselves it had been the landlady being nosy. That explanation felt safer, even if it didn't quite fit. Still, we insisted the locks be changed. When the landlady and her husband came to do it, they noticed something disturbing. The area around the keyhole had been scratched and damaged, like someone had used tools to force their way in. A couple of days later, my boyfriend told me there was something else. The orange kitchen scissors were gone. We searched the apartment top to bottom, but they never turned up. 6 months later, they're still missing. So someone broke into our apartment, ignored money and valuables, took a pair of scissors, went straight to the bedroom, opened the door, saw me there, and left without a word. I never saw their face, and honestly, I hope I never do. This happened back in January when my boyfriend and I were celebrating our first anniversary together. We decided to make a whole evening out of it and went to a really nice restaurant, dressed up, the kind of place we normally wouldn't splurge on. As a gift, I'd made him a jar filled with 52 little notes, each one saying something I loved about him, one for every week we'd been together. He brought it with him so he could read a few while we waited for our food. People around us seemed to notice, and it turned into one of those nights where strangers feel oddly invested in your relationship. A couple of older diners smiled at us, servers congratulated us, and at one point we were even sent a free appetizer. It was sweet, and we were having a great time. Behind us, though, there was a large table that had clearly been drinking for a while. Most of them looked to be in their 50s or 60s. There was also an elderly woman with a walker, who seemed like she might have been the matriarch of the group. At some point during our meal, one of the men from that table stood up, walked over, and just sat down at our table without asking. He started talking to us like we already knew him. He said that he and his wife, vaguely gesturing toward the table behind us, thought we were both very attractive. Then he asked, completely seriously, if we wanted to come to an after-party with them later. At first, we honestly couldn't tell if he was joking. He even pointed out the elderly woman with the walker and said she'd be there too, which made it all feel surreal. We laughed awkwardly and tried to brush it off. He then offered to buy us a bottle of champagne for our anniversary. I told him we were underage, but thanked him anyway. That didn't seem to discourage him, so he insisted on buying us dessert instead before finally going back to his table. I assumed that was the end of it. It wasn't. When the desserts arrived, he came back over and sat down with us again. Once more, he brought up this so-called after-party, and once again we declined. Then the conversation took a sharp turn. He started making comments about our relationship, asking personal questions, and implying what we'd be doing when we got home. It was uncomfortable enough that we stopped laughing and just stared at him, hoping he'd take the hint and leave. Instead, he escalated. He said we were both good-looking and started talking about us having children someday. We nervously laughed and said we were way too young for that. That's when he pulled out his wallet, opened it, and casually showed us a stack of $100 bills. He offered us money to make a baby right then and there. I don't think either of us even processed what he just said at first. We were stunned. I tried to deflect with a joke, saying that maybe someday, but not now. He leaned in and made another comment that crossed every possible line. At that point, I told him plainly that I was 19. He laughed and made a comment that made my stomach turn. That was when the woman he'd referred to as his wife finally came over. She looked embarrassed and irritated, grabbed him by the arm, and apologized on his behalf, blaming his behavior on being drunk. She then ushered him out of the restaurant. The whole thing left us sitting there in silence, our anniversary dinner completely derailed. What should have been a happy, memorable night turned into something uncomfortable and unsettling. Even now, what sticks with me most isn't just what he said. but how confidently he said it. Like none of it was inappropriate. Like he genuinely expected us to go along with it. It's one of those experiences that makes you realize how quickly a pleasant situation can turn strange when someone decides boundaries don't apply to them. In December of 2021, I started a new job at Menards. It's a place a lot of people assume is male-dominated. But honestly, it's a great job for women too. Whether you're on registers or working in departments like building materials or flooring, you learn how to do things for yourself instead of relying on someone else. I like that about it. I felt independent, capable, and proud to be there. About a month later, in January of 2022, I was working alone in the flooring department when a group of men came in to order vinyl sheet flooring. At first, everything felt normal. I greeted them, asked what they were looking for, talked measurements and prices. Nothing seemed off right away. Then one of the men, let's call him Carl, started making comments about the guys he was with. He pointed to one of them and said something like, "This guy right here is looking for a wife. You'd make a good one. He's very good with his hands." I froze. It caught me completely off guard. My heart jumped, and I didn't know what to say. They noticed how uncomfortable I was and quickly brushed it off as a joke. I forced a small smile because I didn't want to escalate anything, but inside I was extremely uneasy. I remember thinking how vulnerable I felt standing there alone with them. I made up an excuse and said I needed to radio my manager because the vinyl was too heavy for me to handle by myself. That wasn't true. I'd handled it plenty of times before, but I needed a reason to get back up. My manager had been on break, but when she returned, I explained everything and told her I didn't feel safe being alone with them. She came over to help, and honestly, I expected the behavior to stop. It didn't. One of the men kept asking me personal questions right in front of her. How old I was, whether I had a boyfriend, what school I went to. It was uncomfortable in a way that's hard to explain unless you've been there. They weren't yelling or threatening, just quietly invasive. My manager finally told me to step away and go tidy some aisles. Around the same time, the store manager came by and said he needed to do my 1-month evaluation. As soon as we were far enough from the flooring department, I broke down. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until I finally felt safe enough to let it out. Both managers reassured me that I'd handled it well and told me that if something like that ever happened again, I had every right to set a firm boundary. If the behavior continued after a warning, I was to walk away and immediately get a manager. Hearing that helped more than they probably realized. Later that night, still shaken, I texted my manager asking if I could carry a taser at work. I knew it was probably excessive, but the fear hadn't worn off. That message had to be reported, and I was given a verbal warning for the request, since weapons obviously aren't allowed. Still, they told me they understood why I reacted the way I did, and were proud of how long I stayed composed. I kept the taser in my bag anyway, and never told anyone. Around that same time, I had already started taking Taekwondo classes, and that experience pushed me to take my training more seriously. I hated feeling that helpless, and I promised myself that if I was ever put in that position again, I'd be ready to defend myself. When I was 13, my friend and I made what was, in hindsight, a really stupid decision. We went for an evening walk through a part of town that even adults avoided. This was years ago, before 2015, in the middle of January, when it gets dark early, and the cold makes everything feel quieter than usual. There was almost no one around. The only sign of life was a bus stop and a 7-Eleven a couple of blocks away. We were walking past a newly built apartment complex, heading toward the bus stop, when something happened so suddenly that it took a second for my brain to even process it. Someone came up from behind me and tripped over my leg. I felt the impact, heard a body hit the pavement hard, and then a sharp rattling sound, like something plastic or metal skidding across the asphalt. We both stopped and turned at the same time. An adult man was on the ground, scraped up and swearing. scrambling to grab whatever he'd dropped. As he stood up, his behavior shifted instantly. He started yelling at us, his voice loud and angry, and then he moved toward us, shouting for us to come back. I remember the look on his face more than anything else. Not confusion or embarrassment, but something intense and focused that made my stomach drop. We didn't wait to figure out what was going on. We ran back toward the apartment building we'd just passed. Somehow the main door was unlocked, and we rushed inside, nearly colliding with a couple who were heading out. We were shaking and talking over each other as we tried to explain what had just happened. The man hadn't followed us in, and after a moment, the couple stepped outside to look around. He was gone. Completely gone. No footsteps, no yelling, nothing. The couple seemed rushed, and after a brief attempt to calm us down, they left, which meant we were suddenly alone again. Still shaken, we decided to continue toward the bus stop together instead of splitting up. That's when we saw him again. A bus was pulling up, and the same man was calmly getting on. From the distance, he looked composed, like nothing had happened at all. He didn't look at us. He didn't react. The bus drove off, and we stood there, stunned, trying to make sense of what we'd just seen. We got home later that night and didn't tell our parents. We were more afraid of getting in trouble for being in that area than we were comfortable explaining what had happened. More than 10 years have passed, and my friend and I still talk about it sometimes. We never figured out what the man had dropped. All we remember is the sound and a brief flash of something silver in his hand. We don't know why he stopped chasing us, or why we didn't hear him approach in the first place when the street was so quiet. At the time, we tried to convince ourselves it had just been a misunderstanding or a freak accident. But even now, whenever I pass through that part of town, I feel uneasy. Whatever that moment was, it left an impression that never really faded. This happened in 2008, when I was 9 years old, and it's one of those memories that never fully faded, no matter how much time has passed. I lived in a townhome community where the houses were arranged in long rows, with a narrow back road running behind them. Between each section of homes were alleyways that connected the back road to the front streets. Our home was right on one of those alleyways, close enough that you could see straight through to the other side if you stood at the end. Directly across the back road lived an elderly woman. I never knew her name, and no one ever explained her situation to me. But from as early as I can remember, she seemed to have a specific hatred toward kids, and toward me in particular. All of her windows were spray painted over so no one could see inside her house, which already made her feel unsettling. Despite that, she would sometimes leave one bedroom window uncovered at night and stare directly toward my room. On more than one occasion, she shined a red strobe light out of that window, aimed straight across at our house. She would also yell from inside, shouting about how much she hated us. By the time I was in 4th grade, I had learned to avoid looking in that direction altogether. One cold morning in January, I missed the school bus. My dad told me to head outside toward the car while he grabbed his keys and would be right behind me. I remember stepping out into the alleyway, already nervous just being alone out there, when I saw her emerge slowly from the side of the alley next to our house. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I noticed she was holding a large kitchen knife behind her back. She brought it forward, raised it, and started running toward me. I didn't scream. I didn't freeze. I just ran. I was faster than she was, and I made it back into the house, slamming the door behind me. From inside, I watched her walk across and stand on a neighbor's porch, staring straight at our home. I was shaking uncontrollably by the time my dad ran outside and started yelling at her. She yelled back that she wanted to get rid of us stupid kids. My parents called the police. Officers came, spoke to her, and sent her back inside. Later, an ambulance arrived and took her away. There were meetings afterward that my parents attended, but I was too young to understand what happened or what was decided. For almost a year after that, I didn't see her again. Then one winter morning, after it had snowed overnight, I opened our front door, excited to go outside and play. She was standing right on our porch, facing the street, as if she'd been there for a while. I closed and locked the door immediately and ran to my parents' room. By the time we looked again, she was walking away up the street. That was the last time I ever saw her. My family moved far away not long after. People I know who still live in that area say she's still there, and that the windows are still spray painted just like before. Even now, all these years later, I'm uneasy around knives, and I don't like being in places where I feel trapped or watched. Some things don't need to happen twice to stay with you forever.